Boris Johnson is back. The leading Brexiteer is Britain's new Foreign Secretary.
Boris Johnson, ministre surprise des Affaires étrangères.
Nobody had seen this coming. His shock was as nothing to world leaders. The French foreign minister couldn't contain his anger.
He lied a lot to the British people during the campaign, and now he is the one to have his back against the wall.
Can you perhaps explain to us in Germany what motivated you to appoint Boris Johnson to be the Foreign Secretary?
Diplomatic phone lines ran hot. Sweden's long-serving foreign minister tweeted for many. I wish it was a joke. I fear it isn't.
I was, to put it emphatically, somewhat surprised whether this was a joke or not. But it turned out to be the real story.
Boris Johnson's greatest challenge was always going to be winning over EU states who felt he'd traduced the European Union in the referendum. A project many remembered. He first started as a Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph.
Yes, Commissioner Boris Johnson, Daily Telegraph. This sounds like a very large amount of money.
I think the EU foreign ministers tried to engage with him. He was, after all, he was the foreign minister, foreign secretary of the United Kingdom, and as such, it's sort of an important player. But I don't think that he made a major effort to become a major player on the European scene, no.
He fared better, perhaps, with other outsiders, like the Austrian Freedom Party's nominee for foreign minister.
What I cherished about Boris Johnson as a colleague in the Council of European Union Ministers was that he was not one of those who was just reading their little cards. He can truly still master conversation. When I say that I appreciated a lot working with Boris Johnson, it might be that the one or the other would look at me in an astonished way, but I mean it.
The annual Munich Security Conference. This was Boris Johnson's first as Foreign Secretary, but the Brexiteers' language gave offence.
He went to the Munich Security Conference and started going on about Brexit, liberation, liberation. And of course, the Germans were utterly offended.
I just want you to know that there is at least one country represented here today that will shortly, as a result of a decision we've recently made, be liberated to do free trade deals once again.
I would like to tell to the Foreign Minister of the UK that the word liberation in the history of Europe has a very strong meaning. And in these challenging times we are, talking about liberating Britain from the European Union is just bad taste. Thank you.
I said, come on. I have to say, I hesitate to accuse you of pomposity.
Sort of throwaway lines in speeches, which, like, public school jokes, never translated. And so it left him looking rather idiotic, left him looking like a clown. He didn't mean it that way. I mean, he meant it to be affectionate and chirrupy, but it invariably backfired.
I want to reclaim the English language, if I may.
Late for a group photo on Syria in Brussels, claiming his place in the front row. Boris Johnson was asked at Tory hustings last week, did he bond with his European counterparts?
What relationships did you perhaps forge as Foreign Secretary that you can then take forward? Specific examples of relationships you forged that will help you in this negotiating period?
I certainly know most of the key players, have met them and talked to them.
France's current foreign minister is thought not to be a great admirer. Jean-Yves Le Drian last year briefed Boris Johnson about a top-secret meeting of Libyan opposition leaders. Boris Johnson promptly blurted out the news a few days later.
I thought that he was ramshackle, there wasn't enough attention to detail, and the building increasingly found him, just totally exasperating.
Last spring, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson tweeted his re-election congratulations to Fidesz and Viktor Orban for winning the elections in Hungary. But they'd fought an election deploying anti-Semitism. Records show he was a selective tweeter, often congratulating those who'd welcomed Brexit.
It's not my taste. As I told this, the populist style is not a reason to trust any politician. And Boris Johnson, of course, should change it a little bit, at least if he wants to be Prime Minister.
Last summer, the Western Balkans summit in London. The government had begged to stage the event, proof Britain was still a player in Europe. But the host failed to turn up. Hours into the summit, Germany's Europe minister tweeted, "We're still waiting for our host."
Why it didn't went down too well, to put it in the mildest possible terms. I can understand that he felt that he needed to resign, but I think it would have been appropriate for him to turn up at the conference anyhow. He could have done that fairly briefly under the circumstances, but just letting people wait and wait and wait without any information of what's going on was not a stellar moment of UK politics.
Boris Johnson had quit as Foreign Secretary, leaving others to judge his time in the job.
I liked him, really. I liked his tough positions and straightforward interventions.
I put it into a sentence when he left, which was that he was impossible to dislike, but he was impossible to respect.
Okay, come on, let's go to the house.
What?
Come on. Let's go.
I did my
into
best.
the house.
You want to get in the house?
Yeah, come on. They've got a programme. Come on. We don't want to drown. We're not drowning the foreign ministers. Yeah, come on. Yeah.
Who wants to come in the boat? Come on.
He could charm, he regularly infuriated. Officials speak of him lacking focus, not mastering detail. But Boris Johnson shows every sign of mastering the immediate electorate that matters. And after high office, winning the highest office later this month.
Come on, chaps.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP Priti Patel, who's a former Secretary of State for International Development and a supporter of Boris Johnson. I began asking her if she's aware that a number of European foreign ministers think that he's a bit of a joke.
Well, that's not something I've heard. I've spent plenty of time with
I've heard it from them.
So then, you know, why don't they come out and publicly say that themselves?
Some of them have said it publicly in our film.
So Matt, what I would say is that they can have their own views on this and on Boris as well. I don't subscribe to making value judgments on that basis. I think at the end of the day, you judge, including myself, politicians on the type of outcomes that we achieve for our country. Boris, as Foreign Secretary, has always put his country first and served his country. And quite frankly, as somebody that's seen him at the forefront of international diplomacy, standing up for our country in very challenging times, whether it's on issues such as the Syrian crisis, Russia, or with an international forum, actually within the EU as well. I've been to EU meetings with Boris, and I've been in bilaterals with him. I've only seen him put our national interests first.
Was it putting our country's interests first when he didn't bother to show up for the Western Balkans Summit in London, which the Prime Minister had gone out of her way to host in our capital city? Was that acting in the country's best interest?
I cannot recall the circumstances around why.
He didn't show up. He was too busy having a photo taken while he was writing his resignation letter.
Well, I mean, he was leaving government, so I think it's appropriate.
He was still in government at the time.
Well, he was obviously on the verge of leaving government, and obviously that's a value judgment he made.
But he didn't even say that he wasn't going to. He just didn't show up. I mean, that's just not the kind of way a diplomat behaves, is it?
Well, quite frankly, I think if you're about to leave government, the first conversations you have with the Prime Minister, and I've got no doubt that Boris did that.
He could have sent a message to say he wasn't coming.
Well, actually...
It was just a no-show. I mean, this is unacceptable, isn't it? We were made a laughingstock on our own turf.
I don't think we were made a laughingstock at all, because, quite frankly, the British government, and not one individual, is the chair and the host of those kinds of summits and forums. And the British government, through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, had representation there.
The man who represented Boris Johnson, Alan Duncan, is also the man who said he's impossible to dislike and he's impossible to respect. He knows of what he speaks, doesn't he?
Well, look, I know of what I speak about Boris Johnson, and I'm not going to justify Alan Duncan's comments. He should be able to do that himself. I've known Boris Johnson for 25 years, and as I've said, I've campaigned with him, I've worked with him in government in a way in which I don't think enough people have seen. As I've said, he stands very squarely, I think, when it comes to demonstrating our values internationally and standing up for our country internationally, and that's what we would expect.
Now, you were a Brexiteer long before Boris Johnson became extreme one, and he famously had 2 articles for the Telegraph, one in favour of staying, one in favour of leaving, and he opted for the latter. Do you actually trust him?
Well,
when it comes to leaving the European Union?
So, Matt, I do. And these, you know, I've had many conversations, and actually in a way in which I suspect most of your viewers do not understand, and perhaps some of the commentators that are sniping about Boris and making comments about him. And let me remind you, I also campaigned with Boris during the referendum campaign, where he was pretty clear about the issues when it came to our democratic representation, the lack of democracy with the European Union. And on that basis, as I have said, and I'll say it again, to deliver Brexit, you have to believe in Brexit, and I think Boris Johnson is the only person that can do that.
So when he says that we will leave on October the 31st, do or die, that's not a metaphor then?
Well, we will leave come what may, and these are conversations.
Not a metaphor.
We have to leave the European Union. Delay is not an option, and then of course we have to look to work with the EU in terms of that future relationship and future partnership.
Priti Patel speaking to me earlier. Well, joining me now here in the studio is Dr. Helena von Bismarck. She's a German who specialises in the history of the UK's relationship with Europe. That's a bit of self-inflicted harm, isn't it?
Well, I started before all this began, so
right. Okay.
Don't blame me for it.
All right, I'm not blaming you for anything. So whatever you think of Boris Johnson, assuming that he's going to be our next Prime Minister, the fact is that Britain outside the EU will become the European Union's arguably most important partner. Right? Because of geography, because of history, because of our relationship.
Well, it should be the most important partner. The question is whether it still wants to be.
But does the European Union want it to be?
Yes, I think so.
Even with Boris Johnson?
Yes. Well, the thing is, Boris Johnson I think he has a bad reputation. But at the end of the day, if he's going to be British Prime Minister, everybody is just going to work with what they have. And but that doesn't mean that they're going to do what he expects the EU to do, but they're obviously going to be professional about it.
There is an assumption that if he becomes Prime Minister, he will be able to go, I mean, that's his selling point. He goes back to Brussels and he lays down the law and says, well, we're going to start this thing all over again. We're going to open up the withdrawal agreement because they need us more than we need them. So trade is more important than politics. Is that the way they see it in Berlin and Paris?
No, it isn't. And that's just 2016 all over again. We've heard all these arguments before. They need us more than we need them. And that's why we can have our cake and eat it. That's why the German car manufacturers are going to make sure that we're going to have a great deal, because they will lobby the German government into lobbying the EU into giving us a great deal. This whole plan of Boris Johnson's, of what he's planning to do until October the 31st, is completely fanciful. It's never going to work. And it's just astonishing to me how he can just pretend that he can just turn back the clock and propose the same argument.
But the German economy is sputtering at the moment. It's important for Germany that its economy doesn't suffer a major incident. The former Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia had said that a hard Brexit would be the equivalent of Lehman Brothers all over again. So the economic argument must hold sway somewhere, especially in Germany.
It does hold sway. And of course, a no-deal Brexit would be a very bad thing for everyone concerned. But the question is, what's more important? And I mean, German businesses, major companies, they have made it clear that while they really don't want a no-deal Brexit, what they want even less is to see the single market compromised in any way. So that's why there is, of course, no deal is bad for everybody, and nobody wants it. But the question is whether that's enough to convince the EU to completely rip up the deal and give Boris a new one just because he wants it.
But even the DUA, the heart of Europe, the Franco-German alliance, has massive disagreements about Britain. I mean, the Germans never really wanted the Brits to leave for all sorts of reasons, and the French kind of did and do.
Well, I think at this point, in France, there is a tendency to think, good riddance, please let this end. And while I have some sympathy for that, I think it's a very short-sighted idea. It's true that in Germany, the vast majority of people don't want Britain to leave the EU, want a continued close relationship with it. And we've seen that last time an extension was debated, that Germany was actually pulling its weight to grant that extension, whereas Macron was quite sceptical.
But if you are making the argument to stay in Europe, and you look at the way that the top leadership of the EU has been chosen in recent days, which is essentially a kind of backroom, smoke room deal between the French and the Germans. Well, it is. You know, the Spitzenkandidaten system, which they came up with, was basically trampled on. I mean, that's pretty shoddy, isn't it? That's not exactly a great advertisement for the EU.
Well, I'm not very happy about the outcome of the last few days. I don't have that much criticism about the candidates who've now been put forward, but about the way they've been chosen. But can I just say...
It's pretty opaque and pretty unaccountable.
That the European Council is not a backroom. The European Council is an institution, a democratic institution, because all the membership governments are democratically elected. So to call it a backroom is a bit
But it's
much.
a deal that was done despite the result of the actual election that we fought a month ago.
That is true. Then again, the problem with the Spitzenkandidaten was that the EPP and the Social Democrats who came up with the idea didn't, in the end, gain more than 50% of the votes in the European Parliament. And also, they couldn't agree on someone.
Okay. Got to leave it there. Dr. Helena von Bismarck, thanks for coming in. John.